evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. The story of Colton Bushy of Red Pheasant Cree Nation and the man who shot him dead dominated the news this week. Gerald Stanley, a farmer from Biggar, Saskatchewan, was cleared of all charges in connection with that death after a trial in Battleford. The verdict shocked Indigenous communities across Canada. APTN's Chris Stewart met with the leaders of one community. Here's that story.
Today, Red Pheasant Cree Nation, Colton Bushy's home, is like a ghost town. Minus 30 temperatures and winds of up to 40 kilometers per hour have closed most of the Cree community. Mosquito, Grizzly Bear's Head First Nation sits directly next to Red Pheasant. It is about half an hour's drive from Battleford, where Gerald Stanley was acquitted in Colton Bushy's death. Mosquito, Grizzly Bear's Head Chief Daniel Star Chief is also the chair of the Battleford Agency of Tribal Chiefs. Star Chief was at the late-night press conference immediately following the verdict.
Justice wasn't served today. Justice crumbled today. And I feel so heartbroken to the family. I just can't believe it, what happened this evening.
After a weekend of reflection, the chief believes Stanley was careless with his gun.
He wants to scare him off, shooting. Okay? Now, he went in the vehicle, reached to turn the ignition off and accidentally shot Colton. What's the use? What's the use? He's trying to scare him away, and then it's just nonsense. It's crazy.
Chief Star Chief says he was certain Gerald Stanley would pay for his crime.
I know they won't convict him for second degree, but my second thought would be manslaughter. Never thought of not guilty. I never thought about that. But it happened.
Mosquito, Grizzly Bear's Head Councillor Joel Star Chief says his community is outraged by the verdict. He doesn't understand why there was no Indigenous representation in any part of the trial.
Everybody's angry right now. There's no justice. Like, in that courtroom, there should have been at least a couple Aboriginal prosecutors, jury, and, you know, at least maybe a black judge or something, you know, somewhere from somewhere else. Then we could get the proper justice. It was more or less white against natives.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Mosquito, Grizzly Bear's Head, First Nation, Saskatchewan.
Within days of the verdict, members of Colton Bushy's family went to Ottawa. They met with a number of federal ministers over the next few days, including Prime Minister Trudeau. Here's Annette Francis with more.
Following a 2-hour meeting with the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Colton Bushy's family spoke briefly with media. The group also met with the Minister of Indigenous Services this morning. Although they wouldn't say specifically what they discussed, family lawyer Chris Murphy says it's about gaining trust in a system they feel has failed them.
It's a trust issue. Many people have lost trust not only in the justice system, but in the government itself since Friday. And it's a deeply held belief that many people we've spoken to in the last 72 hours feel. And so, again, we're just here to try to build the relationships and so that we can try to regain that trust.
But there are a lot of questions. That's also why they're here. Murphy says they briefly touched on the jury selection process. He says it's an issue that is a quick fix.
Of course, everybody wants an impartial jury, but there are a lot better ways to determine partiality or bias than looking at a person's skin. And so let's change it. It's an easy fix. Not many people would disagree with that, except maybe some defense lawyers.
For young Colton's family, having an Indigenous person on the jury might have made a difference.
Some people have stated that race has nothing to do with this process. Yet the defense felt threatened by an Indigenous person being on the jury. I think that speaks volumes to what we went through and the justice that we were denied through this process. So,
you believe it would have changed the outcome?
It may have. but we'll never know.
Tuesday, the family will meet Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould and Ralph Goodale, the Minister of Public Safety. Anna Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale and Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould took questions from reporters after one of the Bushy's family's meetings with select members of Prime Minister Trudeau's inner sanctum. A senator from Saskatchewan urged action, but as Todd Lamoran reports, it was Colton's mother holding up his photograph that caught the most attention.
I don't really have anything to say, but I am very, very honored to be here, and I'm happy that we got to meet the Prime Minister, and we continue praying that something is done and that we could go home and tell the people that we tried hard and we're still going to keep trying and we're going to keep going and this ain't going to stop.
Senator Lillian Dick called the Gerald Stanley not guilty verdict classic racism.
This whole thing was imbued with racism from day one. The moment they started talking to Debbie Baptiste, the moment that happened, the way the police handled the evidence, and, there was just failure after failure after failure to take Colton's death seriously.
Dick chairs the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Affairs. She has simple advice to the government.
I would suggest they do something that's concrete and easy, because it's not just Indigenous people who are upset. It's all Canadians. We've lost faith in our justice system. And if we lose faith in our justice system, then, chaos ensues.
Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould says she will look at eliminating the process that many Canadians say kept Indigenous people off Gerald Stanley's jury.
We can make changes to the criminal code to eliminate peremptory challenges, but we have to work with the provinces and territories to ensure that there are Indigenous peoples that are in the jury pool, how they notify those individuals.
The Bushy family says the RCMP treated them like they were the perpetrators from day one of their investigation. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale said filing a complaint is the way to go.
The family started the process, as well they should, and they've gone through the first part of it. There are other stages yet to go.
For Senator Dick, the verdict has made it difficult to talk about reconciliation.
I hear a lot of people, my friends, and I've seen on social media, where people are saying, don't even use that word anymore. Don't even say reconciliation, because we are so fed up with the racism. On the other hand, this gives us the opportunity to say, yes, racism exists, and yes, to meet reconciliation and to get a nation-to-nation relationship, we cannot forget about the racism by individuals and by systemic racism.
Senator Kim Pate will also be holding a press conference with the Bushy family Wednesday morning. Todd Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
In Vancouver, hundreds of supporters marched through downtown to demand justice for Colton Bushy. And as Lori Hamlin reports, there was a feeling among many supporters that reconciliation is still a very long way away.
Don't let that anger out of you. Hold it. It's a gift. It's going to get you up tomorrow morning. It's going to help you concentrate on the movement of our people.
David Dennis says he felt pure rage when he first heard the verdict, not guilty.
It was rage. It was something that was deep inside of me that erupted like a volcano. I was choking on my words. I had tears.
Dennis joined hundreds here in downtown Vancouver to turn their anger over the not guilty verdict into action.
There's nothing wrong with being pissed off. It lets you know that you're alive.
It's important for us to hold on to that feeling of anger, because it's the anger that actually wakes you up and says, get off your ass and go do something.
Dennis believes that although there's been a lot of talk of reconciliation, things haven't changed at all.
2 years after Mr. So-and-so took office and promised us all of these great things to change, despite the fact that we've got one of our own as the Attorney General of this country, despite the fact that they make all those glossy words, they don't really mean shit when our kids are being murdered.
Sarah Caddo says what happened in Saskatchewan shows that reconciliation is still just a word.
I want our system to reflect that we are actually in reconciliation. Reconciliation is not for the Native people. Reconciliation is for the white settlers of Canada to get to. And that has to be reflected in all of our systems, whether that's education, whether that's government. So it needs to happen not only from the government down, but from the people up.
I want to gather and celebrate instead of gather and mourn. I want to gather and say our laws on our land is finally here.
Audrey Siegel says the time for action is now.
Like you're hearing them in the background, no peace, no justice. That's not a threat. That's the reality of where we are. And we want peace and we want justice and we want safety for everybody. But it will not come at our expense anymore, because we are rising. We are healing. We are reclaiming who we are.
Lori Hamlin, APTN National News, Vancouver.
More than 200 people gathered for the Winnipeg rally to stand in solidarity with Colten Bushy's family after Gerald Stanley's not guilty verdict. While many Indigenous leaders and youth expressed feelings of anger and outrage, the overall message was one of hope and love. Brittany Hobson brings us this.
Cold wind and frigid temperatures didn't stop hundreds from marching in Winnipeg to show their support for the family of Colten Bushy. On Friday evening, an all-white jury found Gerald Stanley not guilty of second-degree murder in the death of 22-year-old Bushy in August 2016. Negon Sinclair, one of the organizers for the Winnipeg rally, urged everyone to walk forward with peace in their hearts.
We commit to a spirit of love. We can commit to a spirit of change, and we commit to a spirit of growth. And that's what this today is all about.
The day began at the Forks with prayers and speeches. Leah Gazan, one of the organizers for the event, says there's no reconciliation in the absence of justice, and the federal and provincial governments must do right by this.
And I'm calling on the government, I'm calling on persons involved in the justice system to come forward and do the right thing so that all people, regardless of their race, class, gender, color of their skin, can experience justice in this place some call Canada.
The crowd then marched about 10 blocks to the steps of the Manitoba Law Courts, where emotions ran high.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
Law student Kelly Taylor said the Day of Solidarity gives Indigenous and non-Indigenous people the chance to have an honest conversation about race relations in Canada.
It's opening up dialogue, peaceful dialogue, healing dialogue, to realize that, you know, there is a barrier and there is a problem with systematic oppression.
But for some, like Patty Saez, the conversations led to some harsh realizations.
I don't have faith in the system, and I don't feel like my students are safe, and I don't feel like my own children are safe.
And while many feel there's been no justice for Bushy's family, one teen says it's times like this that Indigenous people are the strongest.
It's really empowering to know that your community has your back when things like this happen, and it's just you almost feel, I want to say, safe, being with your own people.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Later in the week, Colten Bushy's family and their supporters wound down their meetings in Ottawa. They called for changes to a justice system they say has repeatedly failed them ever since the night Colten Bushy was killed. Annette Francis has the story.
On the final day of the Bushy family's visit, they began their morning with a press conference.
We've been able to share the story of my brother Colten, of the individual, the loving individual that he was, and who he meant to us as a family. But also to share our hardships and all the systemic discrimination and racism that we endured in the process of his loss.
It's been a whirlwind since the verdict came down last week. Over the past 3 days, the family met with MPs, ministers, and the Prime Minister. And while they're optimistic changes to the justice system will come, it's a conversation that needs to continue.
there's a lot of racism in Saskatchewan, and we hope that our coming here opens dialogue to have meaningful discussions about that racism. Yeah. A lot of Indigenous people are fearful that this verdict supports vigilante justice, which it does not.
They say the responsibility also lies with the provinces.
It's going to be incumbent upon the premiers of each of the provinces as well. We can't forget that this is happening in our home area.
Within a year, they hope justice will be inclusive for Indigenous people.
Whether that be as, proper representation for an accused, or proper support and respect given to a family who's of a victim, as in this case. Mm-hmm. So if that means changes to how juries are selected, that would be great. But we'd like to see overall changes to the systemic discrimination that Indigenous people face within the justice system from the time of the incident right through to a verdict.
The family heads home this evening and promised to push for concrete changes. Anna Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
A big announcement from the Prime Minister this past week, but will it end up being more than words? We'll find out more after the break. Welcome back. In the House of Commons this week, the Prime Minister said his government was going to implement a bold new framework that would finally see the existing rights of Indigenous peoples recognized and implemented. And he was putting Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett in charge of, in his words, a national engagement with Indigenous peoples. Here's how the announcement went down.
As a starting point, it should include new legislation and policy that would make the recognition and implementation of rights the basis for all relations between Indigenous peoples and the federal government moving forward. This framework gives us the opportunity to build new mechanisms to recognize Indigenous governments and ensure rigorous, full, and meaningful implementation of treaties and other agreements. With this framework, we have a chance to develop new tools to support the rebuilding of Indigenous communities, nations, and governments, and advance self-determination, including the inherent right of self-government. This framework could establish new ways to resolve disputes so that collaboration becomes the new standard and conflict the exception.
We will be looking to see if the talk around the table is going to lead to meaningful action on the ground that is going to make a difference in the quality of life of Indigenous peoples. Canada is one of the only countries in the world where Indigenous and treaty rights are entrenched in its constitution. That is a responsibility we should be taking very seriously, not one on which we should ever stake a simple election promise, never to be achieved or revisited.
The rising tide of anger that we feel in this country at the moment will reach further heights if he doesn't deliver on his commitments of today. Because remember, we all know that there's another case coming down for ruling, Tina Fontaine. So I'm afraid, I'm frightened by the prospect, the outcome, if it's a negative outcome for Indigenous peoples again.
On the same day, thousands took to the streets of Vancouver for the annual March for Murdered and Missing Women and Girls. For many, it was a chance to remember loved ones. For others, it's an important opportunity to support the demand for answers in many of the unsolved cases. Tina House reports.
It's a sea of people, as close to 5,000 marched the streets, carrying signs and singing the Women's Warriors song. According to organizers, it's one of the largest turnouts of people yet, as the demand for justice is getting louder.
It's a way to gather up the allies and the supporters and all of the Indigenous people to remind the government that we're here, we're determined, and this has got to change.
Maggie Gisley is holding a sign for her late friend, Dawn Cray. She was a victim of convicted serial killer Robert Pickton. She's been coming every year to offer her support.
It's really emotional because not much has changed in the favor of women.
Angeline Jack is marching for her cousin Jackie Murdoch, whose remains were also found at Robert Pickton's farm. But back in the mid-1990s, Jack said she was a sex worker and a drug addict. Now, clean and sober, she recounts how she could have easily been one of the victims herself.
He had his brother and his uncle with him, I think. They were in a black van. We were passing on Powell there, where the Starbucks coffee drive-thru is. The back window was open, the back door, I mean. They didn't lock it, but they pushed me in the back. They got in the front. The door was open, so I jumped out as the moving van was driving. So I'm proud to be here.
It's a solemn walk as young and old gather to conduct ceremonies along these infamous streets on the downtown east side, where so many went missing or were murdered.
This is the 27th annual Murdered or Missing Women and Girls March here in Vancouver, and these protesters say that they'll continue to hit the streets and make their message known, that they're demanding justice for the murdered and missing women and girls in this country. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Time for another quick break, but stick around, there's more to come. Welcome back. One of the actors on the famed television series North of 60 has passed away. Tina Louise Bomberry played Rosie Dila, the owner of Rosie's Restaurant, on 72 episodes between 1992 and 1997.
Rosie, I'm full.
You need your strength.
I need an Alka-Seltzer.
I'm so proud of you, Leon.
Don't, Rosie.
Oh, come on.
Don't pressure me, okay?
Tina is from Six Nations territory in southern Ontario. She died over the weekend in her home community. Our condolences to Tina Louise's family. And that's all the time we have for APTN National News Weekend. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dennis Ward. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Rosie, I'm full.
You need your strength.
I need an Alka-Seltzer.
I'm so proud of you, Leon.
Don't, Rosie.
Oh, come on.
Don't pressure me, okay?
I'm not pressuring you. I'm just happy for you. We're all happy for you, right? A bowl of soup and a hamburger wants to pay with 100. Albert's a crook and a bootlegger, and you're not backing his tender. Mean it. Thanks. Really.
Pay the overdue charges.
Oh, Nanida.
This young man you've got there.
He's a good boy.
You're married to Leon, right?
Yeah. We look like idiots sending 2 tenders. We'll end up with nothing. Why couldn't Willie bring it?
Because he's helping. Geez, nobody tells me anything. What do you got there?
Popular mechanics. For Leon? Go see your vat. Between 4 and 60 centigrade, which is between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Ask me something. Just don't put up a sign and open up for business. The health inspector's coming up to check out Leon's plans, the site. He'll ask me questions.